Police officers, what are some laws that you feel uncomfortable enforcing because you disagree with them? In the community where I live, hunting is not just a hobby, it's a way of life. It's common to see teenagers with their own weapons and cars by the time they reach a certain age. Our school, however, has a very clear rule: no weapons are allowed on school property under any circumstances. Despite this rule, there have been instances where students, caught up in their morning hunting routine, forget to leave their weapons at home before heading to school. This is exactly what happened to a friend of mine. One morning, he was in a bit of a rush and didn't realize he still had his weapon with him until he was already late for class. The weapon was unloaded and stored in a locked case, tucked away safely in the trunk of his car, following all the safety protocols. Feeling responsible and wanting to correct his mistake, he approached the school office to ask if he could be excused for a short time to return the weapon to his home. He explained that it would take him no more than 15 minutes to do so. However, instead of understanding his situation, the school administration reacted with alarm and called the police. An officer from our local town responded to the call. He listened to my friend's explanation, conducted a thorough search of the vehicle, and found the weapon exactly as my friend had described: unloaded, locked, and securely stored. The officer, recognizing that my friend made an honest mistake and was actively seeking to rectify it, looked the superintendent in the eye and stated firmly that he saw no reason to arrest a young man who was trying to do the right thing. The superintendent was not pleased with this outcome and attempted to have the officer dismissed from his duties. However, the attempt was unsuccessful as it became clear that the situation had been handled appropriately and with consideration for the well-being of all involved. Sounds like this guy's friend accidentally turned his car into a mobile weapons safe on wheels. Good thing the cop was more dad mode than arrest mode. Son, let's not make this a thing. Just drop off your boomstick and get to class. Story 2. My friend works as a police officer in a neighborhood that struggles with serious criminal activity and various other challenges. Every day, the officers gather for a briefing where they discuss the priorities and issues they need to address. One day, the police chief stood up in front of the team and talked about a new focus for their work. The chief explained that they needed to start paying more attention to something called recycling theft. This term might sound a bit strange, but it's actually about a problem that's been happening with the recycling bins around the area. You see, there are many homeless people in the neighborhood who are looking for ways to get by. Some of them have started to dig through these recycling bins to find items that can be turned in for money at recycling centers. These items often include bottles and cans that have a deposit on them, known as CRV, California Redemption Value items. When you return these items, you get the deposit back, which can be a few cents per item. The chief's message to the officers was that they needed to make it a priority to find ways to reduce this kind of theft. It might seem like a small issue compared to more serious criminal activity, but the chief believed that it was important for the community and for keeping the neighborhood clean and safe. My friend and the other officers were a bit surprised by this new priority. They had been focused on more serious crimes, but they understood that all parts of community safety are important. They started to think about how they could help reduce recycling theft without neglecting the other important work they do to keep the community safe. Story 3. As someone who used to work as a police officer in the United States, there are a couple of things that really stick out in my mind about the job. One of the biggest is how much freedom we had to make decisions about what happened to people we encountered. Now, this might not be obvious to everyone, but it's a big part of being an officer. Let me give you an example. So imagine there's a person who gets caught with a small amount of something that's not allowed. This happens a lot, and what happens next can be very different each time. As an officer, I could have chosen to get rid of it and just let the person go without any trouble. Or I could have taken them to jail because having it is against the law. It might sound strange, but it was up to me, the officer, to decide what to do in that situation. Another thing that's interesting is how we can handle things like cars with tinted windows that aren't allowed. If you're not familiar, some places have rules about how dark the tint on your car windows can be. If an officer sees a car with windows that are too dark, they can give a ticket or what we call a citation to the driver. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of just giving one ticket for the car having illegal tint, an officer could give a ticket for each window that's tinted too dark. So if all the windows are tinted, that could be a lot of tickets for one driver. This can be a big deal because it means more fines and more points against your license. These two examples show how police officers have a lot of power to make choices that can really affect people's lives. It's a big responsibility, and it's something that everyone who wears a badge has to think about carefully. Alright, so let me get this straight. Being a police officer is like being a real life video game character with the power to delete evidence or send to jail at will. It's like having a cheat code for life. Anyhow, yeah, I guess the tinting ticket power is more like the annoying mini game you have to play to progress. Congratulations, you've successfully ticketed all 4 windows. Your reward, a headache and the knowledge that you've made someone's day just a little bit worse. Story 4. In the town where I went to college, there weren't a lot of options for places to go out for a drink. There were only 4 bars that you could walk to from the campus. These bars were famous for not being very strict about checking IDs. If you had a fake ID, you could get in without any trouble, and sometimes they wouldn't even ask to see one. The police in the town knew about these bars, but they didn't bother them too much. They figured that it was better for students to be drinking in places where there were adults keeping an eye on things like bouncers and bartenders. These adults could make sure that things didn't get out of hand. The police understood that this was a better situation than what could happen if students were throwing house parties all the time. At house parties, there weren't usually any adults around to supervise, and things could get much more chaotic and dangerous. Story 5. In my line of work as a criminal defense attorney, I've encountered a troubling pattern that particularly affects people in North Carolina who are struggling financially. It often begins with a routine traffic ticket, such as one for speeding. The person who receives the ticket might not have a lot of money, and when they go to court, the judge gives them a bit of time, usually about 30 days after the court date, to pay the fine. But here's where things can get really tough. The amount they have to pay is often between $213 and $263, which might not seem like a lot to some folks, but for someone who's struggling, it can be an impossible sum to come up with. If they can't pay the fine within that time, the Department of Motor Vehicles, the DMV, will take away their driver's license. This is called revoking their license. Now, imagine you're in that situation and you still need to get to work or take care of your family, so you keep driving anyway. The next time you get pulled over, it's not just for speeding, it's because you're driving without a valid license. This is a much more serious charge, and on top of that, you still have the original ticket to deal with. Plus, you'll have to pay extra fees to the DMV just to get your license back, assuming you can sort out the original problem. And then there's more bad news. If you admit guilt for driving with a revoked license, the state will automatically take away your license again for a whole year if it's your first time getting caught, and even longer if it's not your first offense. Many people don't realize how serious this can be until they're already facing charges for driving with a revoked license. That's usually when they come to me for help, realizing they're in a pretty tough spot. However, there is some good news in all of this. I've had conversations with police officers who genuinely want to help people in these situations. They understand that the real goal should be to get the person's license reinstated, not to keep piling on charges. These officers might tell the district attorney that they don't want to pursue the case, or they might arrange for a court date when they know they won't be there, which gives me a chance to get the case dismissed. But looking at the bigger picture, it's clear that this system puts a heavy financial burden on people who are already struggling. It seems to be more about generating money than helping people get back on their feet. It's a situation that takes advantage of those who are less fortunate, and it's a real challenge to navigate for everyone involved. Story 6. During my time as a police officer, I had many occasions where I needed to pull drivers over. This usually happened when I saw someone doing something silly or not very safe on the road. Instead of writing them a ticket right away, I would talk to them. I would explain what they did wrong and why it was important to be careful while driving. After our conversation, I would check if they had any unresolved legal issues like warrants for their arrest. If everything was okay, I would let them continue their journey without giving them a ticket. My way of dealing with traffic stops was a bit different from what some other officers did. Because of this, I would sometimes get curious looks from my colleagues. They would notice that on the forms we used to keep track of our work, the space where we were supposed to write down the tickets we gave out was often empty next to my name. Even though this was the case, I never got in trouble for it. This is because it's actually against the rules for police departments to have a system where officers are required to give out a certain number of tickets, whether those rules are written down or just understood. Since there was no quota for tickets, the way I chose to handle traffic stops by focusing on education rather than punishment, it was perfectly fine and couldn't be used against me when my performance was reviewed. Hey, if you're enjoying the video, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 7. When I worked as a police officer, there were certain laws that I didn't agree with, particularly those related to grass. When I discovered someone with it, my response was straightforward. I would instruct them to get rid of it right there on the ground. I adopted a similar approach when I found young people who were not of legal drinking age. I would pour the drink out and let them go without any further consequences. Moreover, I had a policy of not writing tickets for small issues with people's cars, like a headlight that had stopped working. If I noticed something like this, I would approach the driver in a friendly manner and let them know about the problem. I would explain to them that it needed to be fixed, but I wouldn't give them a ticket for it. I also felt reluctant to issue tickets for vehicle registrations that had expired, especially if it was obvious that the person was going through tough financial times. The idea of giving someone a ticket for something that was essentially a result of not having enough money didn't sit well with me. I felt like I would be punishing them for being poor, and that thought bothered me deeply. I believed that such actions would make it hard for me to feel at peace when I went to sleep at night. Story 8. In the United Kingdom, there's a principle that allows people to use what's called reasonable force to defend themselves, help others, or protect their property. This isn't a specific law written down somewhere, but rather a general rule that people are expected to follow. The tricky part is that reasonable force can mean different things to different people, depending on the situation. I remember one particular incident quite clearly. A man was at home, relaxing on his couch with a beer and watching TV, when suddenly an intoxicated person walked into his living room through the front door without any invitation. This led to a tense situation, and the hammered individual who was trespassing became hostile. A fight broke out between the two. To make a long story short, the homeowner ended up forcefully removing the trespasser from his home, and the altercation was so intense that the trespasser was left with some serious injuries. He ended up in the street and then called the police to report the incident. When the police, including myself, arrived at the scene, we could see that the trespasser's injuries were quite severe. This led to the homeowner being arrested on suspicion of causing grievous bodily harm, which is a serious offense. Being involved in that incident left me feeling quite conflicted because I felt a lot of sympathy for the homeowner. I couldn't help but think that many of us would have reacted in a similar way if we were in his shoes, faced with an unexpected and aggressive intruder in our own homes. Story 9. I used to be a police officer, but I've since left that job. During my time as an officer, I didn't often arrest people for using grass for their own personal use. I believed that it was a harmless plant and didn't think it was right to get people in trouble for using it in their own homes. However, when it came to selling it, I took a different stance. Many people who sell it are connected to larger criminal organizations or involved in more serious crimes. I didn't agree with that kind of activity and would take action against it. There was a particular incident that I remember quite well. It was a situation where my fellow officers would have immediately made an arrest, and according to the law, I was supposed to look into it, but I decided not to. One time, a car had accidentally driven into someone's house because the driver got confused and pressed the accelerator instead of the brake. In one of the rooms of the house, there was a single grass plant. In my state, having it as a plant is considered a very serious offense, and people who grow it can face severe legal consequences. To prevent anyone else from seeing the plant and causing a big commotion, I stood in front of it so that the firefighters and other responders wouldn't notice it. The owner of the house was a good person, someone who went to church and was a father. He had a good job and was a valuable member of the community. I didn't feel it was right to cause harm to his family over something as simple as a plant. After I stepped outside for a moment and then went back into the house, the plant was no longer there. The homeowner must have been extremely nervous the entire time I was present. Now that I'm no longer a police officer, I've considered writing a letter and putting it in his mailbox to let him know that I was aware of the plant. However, I decided against it. I didn't want to make him feel worried or paranoid about the situation. Imagine the plant's perspective. Yes, one minute it's chilling in its cozy little spot, soaking up some rays, and the next there's a car in the living room and a cop playing defense like it's Super Bowl of horticulture. Now talk about of unexpected growth opportunities, huh? Story 10. As a police officer, it's my job to enforce the law, and one of the rules I have to uphold is about using cell phones while driving. If I see someone with a phone in their hand while they're behind the wheel on the road, I'm supposed to give them a ticket. This ticket costs $164, which is a pretty hefty amount for most people. However, I understand that everyone makes mistakes, and sometimes you might need to check your phone quickly, like when you're stopped at a red light. If I notice you using your phone at a red light but you're still paying attention to what's going on around you, I'll probably just give you a warning instead of a ticket. It's important to be aware of your surroundings at all times, even when you're not moving. On the other hand, if I catch you using your phone while you're actually driving, moving from one place to another, then I have no choice but to give you a ticket. This is because it's dangerous to be distracted by your phone when you're supposed to be focusing on the road. I know that a lot of people check their phones when they're at a red light, and I get that. We're all busy and sometimes we need to stay connected, but I want to remind everyone to be quick about it and to always be ready to put the phone down and drive safely as soon as the light turns green. Story 11. There was a man I used to work with who spent 19 years as a police officer. After all that time, he decided to leave because he was really upset with how the courts dealt with people who had problems with illegal medicine, whether they were using them or selling them. Here's what would happen. Someone would get caught and put in jail, but then they would be let out again by paying a very small amount of money, sometimes as little as $40. After they were out, they would usually agree to a deal where they would pay a fine, like $500, and they would have to go to a class to help them deal with their habitual problem. But most of the time, they wouldn't go to class. When they didn't show up, the police would have to go after them again because there would be a warrant for their arrest, and the whole thing would start over from the beginning. I felt like the courts weren't really trying to fix the problem. A long time ago, people thought that putting users in jail would help them get better, but it didn't work. Instead, these people would get stuck in a loop of having to pay fines and fees, and they would keep getting in trouble with the police, but nothing good would come out of it. Meanwhile, the judges were making a lot of money, and it seemed like they were just going through the motions without caring about the real issue. Because of all this, police officers had to keep arresting the same people over and over. They would do this until one of two things happened. Either the person found a way to stop using on their own, or they took too many and it was really bad for them. On top of that, it can make people act in crazy and dangerous ways, so the officers were always in danger, and it felt like they were working really hard for nothing. In the place where I live, you have to work for 25 years as a police officer before you can retire. But because of the problem with and how they were being handled, it felt like a very tough job that just never ended. Story 12. My sister works as a police officer, and when she first started her job, she was told a story about a man who had been in the army and had come back from a place called Afghanistan. This man found out something very upsetting. His wife was spending time with another man, which made him feel very sad and very angry. The wife started to cry and told the man that he could find proof of what she had done in the garbage bin. Overwhelmed by his emotions, the man lost control and put a hole through the wall in a burst of anger. After he did that, he realized how angry he had been and how he could have really hurt his wife. He felt very bad about what he had done, so he went outside and sat down on the edge of the sidewalk, and he started to cry because he was so upset with himself. The police were called to the house because of what had happened, and they had to take the man to jail. Even though the police officers felt sorry for the man and understood why he was upset, they still had to follow the rules and the law. Many years later, one of the police officers who had been at the house that day saw that man again. It was a very sad thing to see. The man had no home and was living on the streets. It seemed like his life had taken a turn for the worse after that day when he got so angry and ended up in jail. If any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for hanging with me on this one.